what is up, y'all? Hopefully you're having a good day out there, and if you are not having a good day, I hope that it gets better soon. We are almost halfway through Black History Month already, and for this episode, let's get back to our roots, the whole basis of this podcast. Let's talk about racism. Let's talk about the concept of anti-racism, because as we know, being not racist isn't enough, especially not in today's climate. And I know some of you may be thinking, ugh, Maggie, again with the uncomfy content. I was liking the AI content and the book content. We're back to racial content. We're back to saying that proverbial swear word that is race. Yes, we are. Buckle up, Buttercup. We are going to have this conversation and we are going to talk about it because you know why? Because it's still an issue in our country. And as long as it's still an issue, we should be talking about it and how to fix it. And honestly, how we fix it is by acknowledging that it exists and by talking about it, by making it a household conversation that isn't shameful or taboo or radical or extreme. It's just talking about different humans and different experiences, taking accountability where we need to, owning up to where we maybe aren't doing enough and could be doing more, but that's okay. That's what we're here for, and all we can do is to be open to new ideas and different ideas and try to learn more about each other and do better than we did yesterday. And honestly, you really think about it, almost every single social problem we have, in some way or another, boils down to an issue with somebody somewhere in some position of power not being a decent enough human being and not caring enough about somebody else. Housing crisis, homelessness, the economy, military involvement overseas, inflation, governmental control, lack of governmental control, climate change, all of it boils down to somebody somewhere not caring enough. So first things first, let's get into this concept of allyship and anti-racism. So anti-racism is just the active step of dismantling racial bias and unequal social structures, right? It's not just about being not racist. It's actively rallying around diversity and putting your best foot forward to actually reverse racism. There's a thing going around about wearing on social media about wearing blue bracelets to show you support the Black community. And from my perspective, what I've been seeing, it seems like a lot of the Black community kind of halfway appreciates the effort, but are also like, that's just not enough and that's barely helpful. I saw a post that I loved and it said, quote, "Stop worrying about whether Black women know you're a safe white woman to be around, and start making sure white women know you're not a safe person to be racist around," unquote. And I think that is everything. I think that's something that I needed a reminder for, because I do think sometimes I focus too much on the people that agree with me and not enough on the people who don't agree with me. Because it really is all about those little comments, the unconscious bias, the well-intentioned jokes. Those are all the foundational blocks of racial injustice and systemic racism that's just so deeply embedded in our country, in our day-to-day, in our schools. And now I do have a couple tricks that I personally like to use whenever I'm around those uncomfy situations and where people are making insensitive comments or jokes. And these are all tricks that aren't going to get you into trouble, because let's face it, there are many more scenarios where you can't just speak up versus scenarios where you can. And so one, I just don't laugh at the jokes. I hold a straight face, and I will say it works surprisingly well. Like, it definitely gets the message across. And you got him with a little negative reinforcement, you know what I mean? And then two, I hit him with a little, "What do you mean by that?" And it forces them to acknowledge publicly just how unfunny their comment actually was. My personal favorite lately, though, is just a good old well-placed yikes. Yikes. It's a great standalone statement, really drives home the message, you know what I mean? And this one you can't use with your bosses, though, so fair warning, that is a bummer. Now, the other part of slowly dismantling systemic racism brick by brick is to actually just raise awareness to diversity. And I know that's a hot topic buzzword right now, but I really do think it's key to building a healthy and equitable social environment. And it's so simple. That's what gets me. It's like, it's literally so easy to just incorporate it into your daily lives and into other people's lives. Like, it's so easy. Read diverse authors. And really think about it. When was the last time you read a BIPOC author or a book with diverse characters? I intentionally, maybe this is petty and spicy of me, whatever it is, what it is. I intentionally will recommend books and like diverse books with diverse casts to people that I know don't otherwise read diverse books, just to kind of nudge them in the right direction. And depending on how stubborn they are, sometimes I leave out all of the aspects of why it's diverse, because then I know if I tell them ahead of time, like, hey, this is a queer book, this is a BIPOC book, this talks about whatever. If they're very stubborn, I know they won't even pick it up. And so sometimes they'll be like, yeah, it's got dragons in it. And, yeah, it's so good. And then they're like, oh, yeah, I'm hooked. And then they read it. And then it's like, surprise, main character's gay. You got to do what you got to do sometimes, though, And the same thing with movies and shows, too. Like, are you watching shows with diverse cast members? And not just the stereotypical one black guy in the friend group or the one Asian girl. I remember one time, this was a couple years ago maybe, it was right when the Other Black Girl TV show came out, and I watched it and I loved it because it's right up my alley, right? It's a comedy mystery thriller about an editorial assistant. And I told someone about it and I just described the plot and they were like, oh my God, that sounds so good, blah, blah, blah. And then I told them the title and they looked it up and they looked at the cover art pictures. And they didn't say anything explicitly, right? They didn't say anything negative or whatever. But I could just tell that they were suddenly not as interested anymore. And honestly, I don't even think they even watched it because it was like, quote unquote, black content. Now, let me get this straight, right? Like, will me watching The Other Black Girl reverse racism in the country? No. But if I can be comfy and open to consuming black and brown media, and if I can raise my daughter in that environment where we watch Tiana and Beauty and the Beast, and we read books with pictures of kids that aren't just blonde hair, blue-eyed, and then she grows up learning that diversity is normal and not to be stifled. And maybe I throw some BIPOC book recommendations to other people, and then they read diverse perspectives and characters. And then they start liking the black book talkers videos instead of just the all-white female book talkers. And then they get comfortable around diverse perspectives. And then all of these things snowball, pile up, and then it's not so scary to consider, hey, maybe we shouldn't ban mixed ethnicity relationships. Let's not sign that executive order for Project 2025. And no, Elon, we don't believe that interracial marriages should be illegal. And so will all of that help reverse systemic racism? I hope so. So yeah, maybe picking up that different book or watching that different TV show, maybe it is that deep. Maybe it is that serious. And let me foot stomp something I hear a lot when I talk about instilling anti-racist thoughts into kids and actively talking about some of these barriers and the social injustices. I feel like the common sentiment that I hear is that they're too young and kids don't see color, so we're actually creating this racial bias by saying that it exists and by acknowledging it. And, they don't know any better and yada, yada, yada. And to that, I respectfully disagree because I feel like, and I could be wrong, correct me if I'm wrong, right? I feel like every single minority I've ever spoken to about this topic, none of them have said, oh yeah, my whole childhood, my whole life, I've never experienced racial bias or unconscious bias or just generally insensitive comments about my culture. I don't think I could name a single person that has honestly said that to me. I think every single minority that I have ever spoken to, at one point or another, they have experienced racial inequality at some point in their life. And again, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's just what I'm perceiving. And so I do feel like we can say minority kids are looked at differently, unfortunately, by other kids. They do feel the microaggressions and sometimes macroaggressions of racial bias in schools, at daycare, everywhere they go. They are treated differently, unfortunately. Even just something as simple and harmless as their culture's food. I know I've talked about this before, but Daniel not being able to bring his kimchi to school or to work because other kids thought it was weird and stinky and whatever else. I'll share a great video on the podcast Instagram page about a dad telling his experience raising his daughter to be anti-racist. And he ends the video by saying, although racism makes white children uncomfortable, it makes black children dead. And I think that sums everything up. It is that serious, and it is that deep. And I think it all starts with exposure to diversity. Simple as that. Because I think a lack of diversity awareness leads to some really, really dangerous thinking. And when people in power are too close-minded to diverse lifestyles, we can do some really, really serious damage. For example, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as a Secretary of Health, the face of the Make America Healthy Again campaign. Let's talk about him for a second. Now, do I think we should be looking closer at what's going into our foods? Oh yeah. Do I want everyone to be healthier? Sure. Do I think there are some crazy dyes and preservatives that are banned all across the UK for very valid reasons that are still everywhere in our foods? For sure. But I also have been watching clips of RFK's hearings before he's elected into this position, and he's been saying some pretty concerning things. For example, recently, I think this was January 30th, he said that Black people need fewer antigens than white people and should therefore be on a different vaccine schedule than white people. He cited a Mayo Clinic study as his defense, but I went through and it was literally like textbook correlation versus causation type of situation. And the study's author, they publicly stated they do not recommend a vaccine schedule change based on race alone because the body's immune response to vaccinations can vary by a dozen different factors. And it just leads us back to that archaic type of thinking and that pseudoscience that Black people have a higher pain tolerance and or they don't feel pain. And I mean, look back at episode 7, right at the beginning of this podcast, racial disparity in healthcare settings. I went into a whole deep dive on the insane maternal death rate for African American moms, like today, still currently in modern times with modern medicine, because the doctors just straight up do not listen to them and don't take them seriously when they say something is wrong. And they don't listen when they say this hurts, I'm in pain. It's a 10. They just don't listen. They straight up do not listen. And it literally leads to people's deaths. And I mean, yeah, I'm going to be dramatic. I'm going to take it there. The whole why, because I'm a why person. How did this get started? Why did people believe that Black people don't feel pain? And really think about it. Because if Black people didn't feel pain, then the white people didn't have to feel quite so guilty when they were being tortured and beaten and starved and punished for nothing. And for all my moms out there, buckle up. Because we're about to get extra uncomfy. We're going to talk about James Marion Sims. He is the father of modern gynecology. I'm literally getting chills reading about this guy. But this podcast is about learning, and learning means listening, even when it's uncomfortable. So here we go. I heard about this guy originally in a video on Instagram, and then I pulled a bunch of this background information from history.com and other articles. And so Sims developed pioneering tools and surgical techniques related to women's reproductive health. In 1876, he was named president of the American Medical Association. And in 1880, he became president of the American Gynecological Society, an organization that he actually helped found. He's got half a dozen statues around the country, but here's the kicker. He did all of his research and treatments and surgeries on enslaved Black women without anesthesia because they don't feel pain, remember? He invented the vaginal speculum, which again, all my females out there, you know the pain. If you've ever gotten a pap smear, you know the pain. He also pioneered a surgical technique to repair vesicovaginal fistula, which was a common 19th century complication of childbirth, where you'd tear between the uterus and the bladder, causing constant pain and urine leakage. Now, at the time, these women were enslaved, so the procedure and the research, all the consent for these procedures and treatments only came from their owners, who obviously had a strong financial interest in their recovery. Because what value are you if you can't reproduce? And his backstory was lovely. He was born in 1813 in North Carolina, and he entered the medical profession after interning with a doctor, taking a 3-month course, and studying for a year at college. Then he started practicing medicine. I've had shits longer than this guy was training and studying. That's insane. But anyway, his first 2 patients died, shocker, so he sought a fresh start down in Alabama. He was working predominantly with enslaved people, and then eventually, after treating a woman's fistula, he became fixated on gynecology. Honestly, I'm gonna say it. I think it's super pervy. I was reading these articles, and they didn't mention a single thing about any sort of him taking advantage of these patients. They didn't say anything about his intent or why he was so fixated on gynecology. This is just a me vibe from reading. It seems super, super pervy and uncomfy. Really, really pervy. But that's just my perspective on it. That is my take. Those are my vibes, just my gut reaction. There isn't necessarily any evidence to support that gut reaction. I'm just sharing my vibes with y'all. Anyway, he became fixated on gynecology, and back then, with the enslaved patients, if the patient's owners provided clothing and paid taxes, Sims effectively took temporary ownership of the women until their treatment was completed. So he later reflected in his autobiography, The Story of My Life. He was talking about the advantages he found working on people that were essentially his property. Quote, "There was never a time that I could not at any day have had a subject for operation," unquote. According to Sims, this was the most, quote, memorable time of his life. And quick refresher on consent, it only actually exists if they're able and allowed to say no. Just throwing that out there. Because of Sims' records, we do know the names of 3 of his fistula patients. The first one he operated on was 18-year-old Lucy, who had given birth a few months before and hadn't been able to control her bladder since. During the procedure, patients were completely naked and asked to perch on their knees and bend forward onto their elbows so their heads rested on their hands. Lucy endured an hour-long surgery, screaming and crying out in pain as nearly a dozen other doctors watched. As Sims later wrote, quote, "Lucy's agony was extreme," unquote. She became extremely ill due to his controversial use of a sponge to drain the urine away from the bladder, which led to her contracting blood poisoning. And then he continues on. He says, quote, "I thought she was going to die. It took Lucy 2 or 3 months to recover entirely from the effects of the operation," unquote. I can only barely imagine a smidgen of what this girl went through. This 18-year-old girl. An hour-long procedure with no pain meds. That shit hurts. A pap smear hurts. And that's like barely, pun intended, scraping the surface. And that's literally what, seconds? And it hurts. And it kind of, you get this residual like cramping, hurt pain. Whatever, it doesn't matter. But that hurts. I had the birth control that goes in your arm for a little bit. And when they tried to take it out, and they numbed it up too. I mean, they use like the tiniest little bit of lidocaine. And it wasn't embedded in my bicep, but like, I think the doctor was just new. I don't know. He like couldn't get it out. And so he was just digging around in my arm. And that hurt. That was like very uncomfortable. I was not loving it. And that was also probably, it felt forever, but it was realistically probably 20 minutes-ish that they were digging around before they finally called in another doctor and then they scooped it right out. So imagining an even worse procedure with much more pain, with zero anesthetic for an hour, that's wild. That is wild to me. So for a long time, Sims fistula surgeries were not successful. After 30 operations on one woman, a 17-year-old enslaved woman named Anarcha, or maybe it's Anarcha, I'm not positive. She was only 17. She had 30 operations. And she had had a very traumatic labor and delivery process, I guess. And then that's when he finally, quote unquote, perfected the method after 30 operations on this girl. After 4 years of experimentation on her. And afterward, he began to practice on white women using anesthetics, which was new to the medical field at the time. Before and after his gynecological experiments, he also tested surgical treatments on enslaved black children in an effort to treat trismus nascentium, which was neonatal tetanus, with little to no success. Sims also believed that African Americans were less intelligent than white people and thought it was because their skulls grew too quickly around their brain. He would operate on African American children using a shoemaker's tool to pry their bones apart and loosen their skulls. In the 1850s, Sims moved to New York and opened the first ever women's hospital where he continued testing controversial medical treatments on his patients. This is classic misogynistic ego right here. When any of Sims' patients died, the blame, according to him, lay squarely with, quote, the sloth and ignorance of their mothers and the black midwives who attended them, unquote. He did not believe anything was wrong with his methods. And I did read that a lot of his statues are getting some heat around the country, and some of them have been put into storage, and or the names of his patients are being added to the plaques to raise awareness. Hopefully this background and this story disgusts you as much as it did me. And you may be thinking, okay, yeah, that's awful, but it's not happening today. It's not like that anymore. And to that, again, I respectfully disagree, because look at RFK's comments saying that black people have fewer antigens than us, and so they need a different schedule of vaccines. Look at the maternal death rate in L&D units for African Americans today. Beyond the race aspect, look at how many women aren't giving any anesthetic for IUD placements and removals today. But men have any procedure and they get 2 weeks con leave, hella pain meds, etc., etc. It is still happening today, and it's just one more example of the racial disparity and injustice in our society. And I know right now, in the current political environment, the term Nazi and racist and fascist, they are being thrown around for everybody a little bit willy-nilly. And yeah, you're gonna get defensive if someone calls you a Nazi just because you wanted to vote for the change, you wanted to vote for the non-political background, the working man, because you wanted something different, you wanted something more relatable, whatever. Like, I get it. I really do. But I do challenge you to look inward and really ask yourself, am I doing everything I can to support everyone? All minorities, all aspects of life, everyone. No asterisks, no exceptions, everyone. Am I truly doing everything I can? Or am I more upset about being called a racist than I am upset about racism? And with that, I will leave y'all to your own thoughts. Make good choices, be a decent human being, take care of each other, take care of yourself, read a diverse author, watch a diverse show. I challenge y'all. Let me know what you end up watching or reading. I would love to hear about it. Let me know what your thoughts are, and I will catch y'all next time. Okay, bye.